Developing our skin material is a key milestone in the portrait creation process. It's paramount that we get this right. So we need to take our time. We're going to go step by step in a methodical, incremental process. So please be patient. The reward will be worth it. And to start off, there's something I need to address, and that is the scale of our model. Frankly, it's nowhere near real-world scale. So if we select our head object by itself and look at the item properties, we're looking at 3.3 meters tall. Or if you're American like me, that is 11.1 feet tall. So since this is an instructional course, I think it's important that we establish the standard of real-world scale, because that does have an effect on render settings, light intensity, material properties. And without establishing that standard, the values are all over the place and it's going to be harder to follow. So it's better to set up real world scale, frankly, as soon as possible. I failed to do this because I was basing my scale on the grid units for that whole formulaic approach in the very beginning of the course. But when it comes to materials and especially adding hair, you're locking yourself into the scale values. And so before we get any further, it's better to establish that scale. Now, I want to find a value to judge the height of the head. So if we jump over to Google and type in average height of the human head, we should be able to find this information fairly quickly, maybe by an image, just to make sure we know what this value is. Does it go to the hairline? Does it go to the top of the head? That kind of thing. And I believe this image helped me out earlier. Yeah, okay, so we see that from the bottom of the chin to the top of the head is value 14. And for men, that's about 9.1 inches, it looks like. Yeah, so the 50th percentile, middle of the spectrum, 9.1 inches. Let's go back to Blender, and I'll create a box or a cube, and we'll change the value to be, well, let's do it in each axis, 9.1 quotes for inches, and that will automatically translate over to metric. And now this tiny cube is the actual scale of a human head. All right, so we are pretty far off of that. I'm going to make this cube not selectable in the outliner. And then I'm going to select everything, and we will scale down until our head fits in that cube. Once I've got the head inside this box and everything selected, I'll hit Control A and apply the scale. All right, now the camera doesn't get applied. That's fine. If I try to apply the scale, it gives me an error. Objects have no data to transform. But like the head is at XYZ 1 in terms of scale. The hoodie is that way. Everything else should be at a value of 1. Okay, since I scaled everything down, our camera angle should still be consistent as well. Basically no visual difference from the last video. We can get rid of that cube. But now that we're in a real world scale, our values will be consistent with what we look up on the internet and also between you and me. All right, with that out of the way, we can begin dialing in our material. So I'm going to turn off our clothing collection in render and in viewport visibility so we can just focus on our head. And the first thing I want to establish is a full frame render of a gray material, basically a clay render in other words. And the important concept of a clay render is to establish good values for our lighting and material. Right now, they're not really aligned, and they need to be in order to trust the material settings we're going to make in the future. So this will lead me to change a few things. I'm going to split my shader view here. So on the left side, I can have the object material properties, and on the right, we can have our world. And if we look at our principled BSDF, the default base color is basically white. It's a really high value of 0.8, and I want to take that down to 0.5 because I think a mid-level gray is a much better value to judge our light energy. And this color should match pretty well the most illuminated part of our face. However, I do not like the default filmic color space. Or I should say that it's just harder to determine appropriate light values in my experience. So if we go to our render settings at the very bottom, you have color management. The default is filmic, whereas the legacy default is standard. So if we switch over to standard, you'll see that our illuminated part of the head is actually blown out tremendously. And this data to me is important because it's telling me that the light is too strong. So I need to take the strength of our environment texture in half, let's say 0.5. Okay, now I'm getting a much more balanced color of the gray next to our base color swatch. Also, you'll notice that we see three distinct types of shading. We see the shadow on the left, in the middle we see the diffuse lighting, and then we also see the speck highlights. Whereas if we switch over to filmic, it's much harder to see the speck. So I'm a big believer in switching over to standard in order to balance out your light energy more efficiently. And at this point, the intensity of this environment texture is now balanced with the color of our material. But remember, we want to have a variety of lighting. So I'm going to duplicate these two nodes, Shift D, anytime I want to test a new environment texture. So let's open another one. Specifically, I'm going to open the Studio EXR because this brings up another point. Shift Control click, and we've changed our lighting. And what I like about studio lighting is it's more white, whereas this previous outdoor texture has a distinct yellow tint to the sunlight, which shifts our understanding of the color. There's also a distinct blue in the fill light, a typical outdoor lighting scenario. So initially, I like to lean on a studio white light based setup. And then once that feels good, I can trust better other lighting scenarios. But back to the balance concept, I think this studio lighting feels a little bit darker. The illuminated parts of the face feel darker than our base color. So this strength, I think, behaves better at a level of 1. And the takeaway here is that your environment textures aren't necessarily standardized. So it's important to balance them out yourself. Now, I would like to use the included studio environment texture that comes with Blender. If we want to try rotating it, you can just hit Control T to bring up a mapping node and rotate in the Z axis. So if we go 90, we've rotated our environment around, just like the viewport, how you can do that here when you turn off Scene World and rotate it around. This ability will come in handy as we add a variety of environment textures. However, the problem with the Studio EXR is there's still a lot of light. It's not very dramatic. We don't have harsh shadows, and I actually want that for dialing in the translucent effect of the skin specifically. So none of the included EXRs are going to be great for that, which is fine because we have an amazing resource in hdrihaven.com. So HDRI Haven has been around for a while, though apparently it's going to become Polyhaven soon. Maybe by the time this course releases, it'll already be moved. Let's go ahead and go to Polyhaven. And it's a library of very high quality, completely free HDRI environment textures. It's a phenomenal resource. And when I say free, I mean completely free. The license is CC0 public domain. It's as free as it gets. I lean on this library all the time. I support it on Patreon. It's just incredible. And we have all kinds of environments, 469 at the time of recording this, but I'm looking for a studio specifically. And you can see that most of these are based on white light. There are a couple up here that have more yellow and other colors in it, but there's one specifically, this one right here, Studio Small 07, that I like to use for my portraits. So we'll click on that. They do offer large resolutions all the way up to 16K. We'll go with the middle of the road 4K. And they have either EXR or HDR. I find that HDR is a little bit larger in file size. So let's go with EXR. And now download this. I'm going to put it in a specific location. So right click, save link as, and we'll go to our project directory, source, texture. And I'm going to create a new folder and we'll call it ENV for environment. I plan to put more than one in here. So we'll save that. Jump back over to Blender. And I'll simply duplicate these two nodes, Shift Control D. Let's restore our mapping node to default and load up the file we just downloaded. In the texture directory, environment, Studio Small 07 4K. Shift Control click on that. And wow, the energy is way different than our other textures. Obviously, it's way blown out. So let's go down to 0.5. What about even lower, like 0.2? Okay. This feels much more balanced. And this type of dramatic lighting is going to be great for diagnosing our subsurface scatter. The only thing I want to change is slightly rotating it around. If I remember correctly, it's changing the X value to 10, maybe? Yeah, so what that does, maybe 20. So what that's doing is kind of casting a longer shadow on the front of the face. Yeah, I do believe 10 is what I liked. And that's a really small change, but I do like the information we'll get from those longer shadows. And so in a nutshell, that's the process we need to take anytime we bring in new environment textures. We need to make sure we're using this base color gray to dial in the intensity of our texture, and then we can trust our material settings, which we can begin playing with. So first thing I like to do is render a standard clay version of our scene, exactly what we see in the viewport. So I'm going to double check our render settings because I think, yeah, they're still set up for baking. So instead of one render sample, we're going to need a lot here. Subsurface scattering is complex to calculate, so it's going to be more noisy and needs more samples. I'm just going to go ahead and go high with 512. We'll probably need to go even higher for final renders. And then performance, I left really high at a 4096 tile size. We want this at 128 for GPU rendering. If you're on CPU, you'll want it to go down to like 64. And double check my, okay, 100% 1080 by 1080. Let's do a first render. Okay, with my mouse wheel hovering over the image, control space to maximize it. Just like our 3D view, but we see our full sculpted detail present in the surface. So this will be a good standard to judge what our subsurface does. Let's switch to slot 2 and enable subsurface. And we can do this simply by increasing the value of the subsurface parameter above 0. So let's try 1. And that is way too high. How about 0.1? Still too high, but we're getting closer. How about 0.01? And now we're more in the spectrum for human skin. The characteristic we're looking for is in the shadows, you can see that distinct red glow, especially on the edge of the shadows. And this is where the harsh shadows from the lighting comes in handy. And this subtle glow is indicative of light passing through the surface and bouncing around inside, giving us a translucent feel to the material. Now, the default subsurface method is Christensen-Burley, and it's not very good for human skin. The random walk method is much better. But let's do a comparison of both just so you can see. I'll switch back to Christensen-Burley and render this. Then switch to slot 3 and random walk. And now let's see the comparison. This is random walk, Alt-J shows us Christensen-Burley. And the Christensen-Burley is much more uniform in its translucence. Pretty much anywhere where there's a shadow, it seems like a uniform level of glow is applied. Compared to random walk, it feels much more dependent on the thickness of the geometry. And in a practical sense, random walk maintains our sculpted details so much better than Christensen-Burley does. Another negative for Christensen-Burley, in my opinion, is that the glow feels like one solid color, whereas if we look at the ear and switch to random walk, on the thinner part of the ear, it's more orange and sometimes even towards yellow, and the deeper we get, it turns to red. And this gradient from red to orange is very desirable when it comes to human skin. All this to say, we ignore Christensen-Burley and use random walk going forward. However, I do think that this value of 0.1 for the subsurface is a little too low. Let's try in slot 4. Let's try a value of 0.02. I can already tell I like that. Look at the ear. That gradient, ooh, it's looking good. This is at 0.1, this is at 0.2. Love the way the subsurface looks on the ear. And in general, I like it everywhere else too. It's perhaps a little too strong as a global value. If I switch between 0.1 and 0.2, I don't know, somewhere in between those values. I think I've established the spectrum, which is helpful. But some areas I like better with 0.01, some I like better with 0.02. But if I hit J one more time to go to slot 1, a reminder of no subsurface scattering, Alt-J, where we are now. Hopefully you can tell that it just feels so much more fleshy and soft. And if you remember, we talked about that in the pore depth testing video in the last chapter, but I didn't explain how to get to a fleshy subsurface material. So that's what we're doing here, and I really like the direction the material is headed already. So let's talk about some other settings. I'll switch to slot 5. And below our subsurface value, we have the subsurface radius. This is responsible for dictating the color of our subsurface glow. Out of the box, the material has a distinct reddish glow, which is ideal for human skin and probably directed at that. But if we open up subsurface radius, we have very ambiguous, non-labeled, non-described values, and they represent RGB. Red at the top, green in the middle, and blue at the bottom. So with a red value at 1, we're getting full red power. Green value at 0.2, we're getting much less green, and then even less blue at 0.1. And in my experience, this is a little too red. We can change all of these to 1 so that our translucence doesn't have a tint towards a color. It's just light passing through kind of in a clear way, which could be very useful for some other material, but for skin, you do want that red tint. However, I do often change the subsurface radius from the default 0.2 in green, 0.1 in blue, maybe like 0.4 in green, just to introduce a little bit more yellowy tones into the subsurface. But keep that in mind as an option for what we can change. Once we add the flesh tone to our base color, the default radius settings usually prove themselves to be way too red. Now, the last subsurface setting is called subsurface color. And this one is the most vague by far. And it's hard to diagnose exactly what it's doing. Historically, I've seen this kind of tint the whole skin. But if we switch to like an extreme green, we really don't even see that effect. If we increase the subsurface value to like 0.1, you should be able to see the green tint. Whereas if we go to blue, it kind of shifts towards blue. We can go to magenta. So in the past, I've used it for like a backscatter type tint, meaning making it like a bright red to represent what's under the skin, but it's only slightly effective at a high subsurface value. When you go down to 0.02, it has much less effect. And so, frankly, I just tend to ignore this. If we right-click, reset to the default value, that's not the default value. If we duplicate principled BSDF, hit the delete key or backspace key to reset it, and then Control-C, copy that color. Isn't it annoying that setting the default setting is a lie sometimes? Anyway, the point being, I'm basically going to ignore this setting, which I like because instead of dealing with 4 settings, we're only going to deal with 3. Kind of simplifies the process. And so the next thing I want to do is introduce a flesh tone to our base color. So if I switch over to our skin color texture, let's simply color source that flesh tone that we painted over. And as soon as we do that, you should be able to tell that our subsurface effect seems stronger. Let's do a render for comparison to diagnose that directly. All right, let's maximize that. Alt-J to see before. And yeah, look at the nose. Look how much more light is making that spot glow from before and after. But we kept the same subsurface value. So why is the translucent effect stronger? I'll tell you why. Remember that our base color value, that mid-level gray, was at a 0.5 value. However, this skin tone is at a 0.8 value. So the important nugget of information is that the value of the base color does affect the depth of the subsurface effect. So the higher the value, the stronger the effect. So our options are to either dial down the value of the base color. Let's see, we'll escape the render so we can see that effect in the viewport. So if we go down to a value of 0.5, it's much more consistent. We have much less glow in the nose. But this is a disconnect from our color texture that we painted because we would have to dial that value down. We could do that, or we could balance it out going back up to 0.8 in the skin tone and take the subsurface value down to 0.01. And that should more or less balance them out. So let's do another test. Make sure that we're on slot 5, before and after. Okay. Okay, let's maximize that. This is at a value of 0.1, Alt-J. This is the gray version, and I'm trying to look at the translucent effect. It feels much more balanced. All right, the same amount of glow from this one to this one, okay? However, look at the ear. I think we are losing some translucence in the ear. So this reinforces that nugget of data that it's likely we'll need to add subsurface more in certain parts of the face than others, namely the ear, as far as we know at this point. But this was one small step towards a flesh tone. The next step is to add our color texture finally. So we'll switch to slot 6, go back to our user interface, and let's grab that color texture and plug it in. Let's see, it was down here at the bottom. Let's make a little bit more room, move these textures over, grab our color, Shift Control click on it. There it is, and plug it into our base color. Shift Control click on the principled BSDF and do a render. Okay, this one's kind of a big one. And that's what our texture looks like. So before, just a uniform single color, and now with our color texture, it looks all right. Right away, I feel like our 5 o'clock shadow is too gray. It needs more flesh tone. But as far as the color of the translucence, the reddish tone, I think it feels pretty good. It's a solid first phase of the skin material as a whole. And though, of course, we'll need to modify this texture, it's not bad for a first test. I've had much worse first tests where the skin texture is just completely wrong. So I'm going to take that as a victory. In the next lesson, we will incorporate our utility texture bakes.